Welcome everyone. While we're waiting for the last few people to join us, do please let us know who's out there via the chat function. It is a very strange experience for Malcolm and myself presenting today's webinar because we can't see any of you. So do please let us know via the chat who's there, which organisations you're from. Oh, lovely. Great to see some friendly faces or friendly names out there. Hi, Matt. Hi, Dave. Oh, fabulous. Nicole from Bioregional. Hello, Mark and Alice up in Chalbury. Oh, Claire from Pure Leapfrog. Wow, they're coming thick and fast now. Fantastic. And we do have a raised hand from Judy. Judy, you've raised a hand, and if you would like to use the Q&A function to let us know if you have a particular question we can help you with, please let me know. Fantastic, lots of Project Leo partners emerging and lots of representatives from local community groups right across the country. And some of your colleagues being cheeky there, Malcolm, too.
I noticed. Now you know who the boss is.
Right, we'll just give everyone one more moment and then we'll get started. Right, well, we are a couple of minutes after 12. 12? Goodness, time flies. 6. So introductions, good evening, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Saskia Huggins, I'm the Social Impact Director at the Low Carbon Hub, and I'm joined here this evening by Professor Malcolm McCulloch. The Low Carbon Hub is Oxfordshire, the Oxfordshire-based social enterprise, which is out to prove that we can meet the UK's energy needs in a way that is good for people and good for the planet. You join us for the second in a series of webinars, which are all focusing on the future of energy and the transition to a renewable energy future. And we're particularly looking at Project Leo. For those of you who don't already know, Project Leo, that's Local Energy Oxfordshire, is a £40 million project funded by Innovate UK, conducting real-world trials to understand the role that local energy can play in accelerating the transition to a zero-carbon energy system. Last week, we kicked off the series by exploring the impact that investment in community energy can make. If you missed that and would like to know about the opportunity to put your savings to work to tackle climate change, you can find the recording on the Low Carbon Hub's YouTube channel. We will also be recording tonight's webinar, so please be aware of that. And this recording will be also made available through our YouTube channel. Next week, our Tuesday evening webinar will be given by Melanie Bryce from Scottish and Southern Electric Networks. They are the lead partner on Project Leo, and she'll be giving us an overview of the first year of the project, and we'll be joined by Adriano Figueiredo, who is the Innovation Director at the Low Carbon Hub. So more details and the registration links for that and more in our upcoming series will be available on the news section in the Low Carbon Hub website or on the events section of our Facebook page. So with that said, let's get into tonight's webinar. Our topic is Energy System Transition, a Better Local Solution. And I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker, Professor Malcolm McCulloch, who is an Associated Professor at the University of Oxford's Department for Engineering and Group Leader of the Energy and Power Group. His academic interests cover a wide range of energy-related areas, from domestic energy, user-centric technologies, renewable generation, and low-carbon transport. Malcolm designed the world's first hydrogen sports car. And he's also got an eye for the practical application of this research. So coming out of all this research, he's set up at least half a dozen spin-out companies. So I first met Malcolm more than a decade ago through a community initiative in West Oxford, when we were 2 of 38 local households who had pledged to try and reduce our carbon footprint by at least 10% over a year. So my efforts were focused on improving my draft proofing, and Malcolm, being Malcolm, was going for a whole house deep retrofit approach. No prizes for guessing who did the best in terms of reducing their carbon footprint there. As well as being colleagues as part of Project Leo, we continue to work together as in our spare time we volunteer as directors of West Oxford Community Renewables, because that's just what you need after a day working in local energy is more time volunteering on local energy. So when you put all that in the round, I really can't imagine anyone better qualified to be championing the role of local energy in the transition to a zero carbon energy system. So I'm about to hand over to Malcolm, and before I do so, just to flag up, Malcolm has said he's really happy to take questions during his talk. So please use that chat function to post questions. We will either try and answer them as we go. I'll be asking them on your behalf, and any that we don't get round to, we will have time at the end of this session, which finishes at 7 o'clock, to run through any more outstanding questions. So all that said, over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Saskia. So welcome everybody to this webinar. It's my first webinar from the site, so if I muck it up, blame me, not the Low Carbon Hub team. So today's little discussion is going to be around energy systems and their transition, and why I think a local approach is a better solution. And for those of you who don't know me, please, I use my name Malcolm rather than Prof McCulloch or anything else. So let's keep it kind of relaxed and informal. So I'm coming from the approach of looking at this from being deeply involved in LEO, which is our local energy Oxfordshire program. And the strapline, as you can see, is to how do we accelerate the energy transition from a local perspective to get to zero carbon. And at the bottom, you can see there are a number of very valuable partners that have been, that are helping us to achieve this goal. So let's just go back to the beginning and to have a look at to say that what we are doing is basically transitioning from this, and some of you might recognize this as a Didcot power station, and some of you might recognize this stuff in the bottom left-hand corner is coal. And there's a shed load of it over there, and you can see that actually we've got a stack pipe there where we have lots of carbon dioxide coming out, as well as a few other nasties. So we want to move from this from this picture to basically something where we no longer are pumping lots of carbon into the atmosphere. And wind and solar and hydro are some of the typical ones, and the one I'll be concentrating is basically looking at wind and hydro. Sorry, wind and solar in this project. What we, the other slight change is that it is not just looking at our generation that's going to be changing, but also what are we powering. Typically, the energy system is used to power our household appliances and our lighting and a few appliances in the work environment. But we're also now going to be moving where we start to cover heating, and space heating may well be an important part as we move forward in our transition. And already we're seeing mobility is becoming part of the electrical system. So remember I talked about it as energy system. What my focus is that it's going to be a largely electrical energy focus, although there will be absolute roles for other energy vectors such as heat networks, and some role of a a hydrogen carrying gas. So if we have a look at the energy transition, what's really interesting to know is I did a little bit of early work with the energy systems operator, that's ESO, and they were creating the what does the future energy scenarios look like. And they basically put this along two axes. One, the horizontal one is the speed of decarbonization, and the vertical one is the level of decentralization. And what they came up with is these basically four scenarios, and these scenarios are basically targeting what the future world might look like if you were either very fast in decarbonization or slow, which is this way, or if you can have lots of decentralization or not. What it turns out is actually you're going to need quite a lot of decentralized resources in most of these scenarios anyway. So the community renewables one is the one that's looking like to going forward. What's also kind of interesting is this was released in July 2019, and a few months later, the government decided that going to 80% decarbonisation is not good enough. We've got to go to 100% net zero carbon. So these scenarios basically were outdated pretty soon after they came out. And there has been some work going forward as to say what are the key issues that need to be that need to adapt and change. And so the 2020 scenarios are basically going to be looking at scenarios where we are going to be achieving net zero in at least 3 out of the 4. What I'm going to be looking at is to say that from Leo's perspective, is the community renewables type of perspective, which basically says that we're going to have a high level of decentralization and a rapid decarbonisation process. Is the scenario they're going to be focusing on. So it might be just useful to get an idea of some of the indicative big numbers for the UK. Now, these are my numbers. These aren't from other ones, but they're based on working through to say what does a minimum cost system look like in the future. And it's largely based around solar, wind, bio, possibly some nuclear, but much lower than other people would suggest. So if you look at those numbers, and just to remember that the total demand in the UK is, I think today it peaked at about 28 gigawatts. So we can see that we need a lot higher power capacity for both solar and wind. So that means each one of those is going to be, we need to get to that order of magnitude, sort of 80 to 100 gigawatts of solar, 80 to 100 gigawatts of wind. What's interesting is underneath that is remember that for the sun is only up for a certain amount of time, so therefore 1 gigawatt of solar resource does not give you 24 gigawatt hours of energy throughout the day. And in fact, if you average it throughout the year, it's only about 10%, 10 or 12%. Wind, on the other hand, will give you about 30% of the time. It's actually giving its fully rated capacity. And when you look at that, it actually means that solar and wind will give you about the same amount of energy throughout the year. So even though the solar looks like it's a lot bigger in terms of capacity, in terms of energy delivery, it's about 25% of the total energy required, and wind's about 75%. In terms of costs, we can see that solar, in order to do that, is going to be on the order of 30 to 60 billion pounds to be able to deploy. And wind is going to be something in the order of 100 to 150 billion. These numbers are uncertain than the previous set because costs are changing on a very rapid basis. Just to give you an idea, the cost of solar panels dropped 30% last year. So it's really interesting, and especially under current conditions, it'll be interesting to see where the prices move. Bioenergy, if we look at bioenergy from internal sources, is going to be relatively small. So I'm going to say it's going to be less than 3 gigawatts. And nuclear, I think, is going to be the really interesting one, is to say, it'd be interesting to see exactly what the minimum is going to be. The maximum is going to be probably about 10 gigawatts going forward. The cost of that, well, that's really uncertain, and especially if we include lifetime costs. Below the line is basically in the future, we're going to be looking at a substantial amount of electric vehicles. At the moment, there are about 35 million vehicles sitting in the UK. If each of those were to have about on average, about a 50 kilowatt hour battery pack sitting in them, that means that actually you'll get 1 to 2 terawatt hours of energy stored in those electric vehicles. And to give you a rough idea, at the moment, we consume about 1 terawatt hour of electricity per day in the UK. So basically, it says that we'll have about 2 complete days of energy storage in electric vehicles. The other thing to remember with electric vehicles is that although it might have 50 kilowatt hours of battery, typical usage will only be about 10% of that under normal conditions. And the investment in electric vehicles is going to be substantial. It's going to be 500 to 700 billion. The other thing to note as well is that the power in those electric vehicles is going to be substantial compared to the power associated with the generation. So one of the interesting plays is that if electric vehicles were to come in a lot quicker than solar and wind, they would actually be the dominant power driver on the network. So that basically sets the context. And so what I want
Malcolm,
to, yes,
we had a couple of questions pop up that I wonder if now would be a good time to answer them, or if you want to
yes, go for it.
hold them as thoughts.
Yeah.
A question from David Calver, who's asking if making local energy the focus risk losing out on economies of scale. Perhaps from those figures, the answer is no, but you perhaps would like to expand on that. And a related question, perhaps, whether or not you're able to comment on Chris Goodall's proposal that massively overbuild renewables is his proposal. How would those relate to the 4 slides?
Okay, the 4 scenarios on slide 6. Okay, so if we take the first one first, is if you look at wind, that is going to tend to be large wind farms offshore. Offshore wind is still a good 20 to 30% more expensive than onshore. So there's an interesting question to say, are we still prepared to bear that cost? And I think there's a mute point around there. I think one has to balance out things, which I'll come out forward about land use later on as one of my challenges. In terms of solar farms, getting to large scale of solar farms is really challenging because you really kind of blight the large areas in one place, and so therefore it becomes really challenging to actually put farms in large places, especially if it's land based in the UK. If you're looking at, there was quite a big movement a few years back to put a large amount of solar in places like Morocco and Northern Africa. And then the whole Arab Spring happened, and you realize that, yes, although the sun is very good there, the geopolitics are challenging at the very least. So I think there's some interesting challenges around whether you go local or large. In terms of being able to, if you look at things like electric vehicles and other electric mobility options, that will have to be local. So a lot of the load is going to be local, even if the generation isn't. And to me, it's going to be both sides, the load as well as the generation, both sides of it are going to start to play a bigger role. Is that okay? I'm going to move on now to some of the big challenges around, on Chris Goodall's one. These numbers, I'm assuming that you're going to probably build out something like 25% more generation than you need, simply because the impacts on the cost of storage are dramatic. And it's much to put an extra wind turbine up than it is to put a 100 megawatt hour battery in play, or looking at other economies. It all depends, but that equation will change as you go through time. So my estimate at the moment is you probably have about 20% over generation is probably where the sweet spot is in terms of the prices at the moment. And we will have to keep a watching of how the generation prices change versus the flexibility prices as we go forward. So if we move on to some of the big 5 challenges that I've worked for the energy system. Now, these are not the only 5 challenges. There are lots of others. I just happened to choose on 5 because I only had 30 minutes to talk through. So the first challenge is one I've alluded to earlier on, is basically how do we deal with land use? And the question is, how do we balance national requirements in the local context? And you can see places like in the Mojave Desert and other places in America and some places in China where there have been large-scale wind farms and have basically made a significant impact to the local environment, to the local look and feel of the place. They could do that because basically there are no people living there, and therefore there's not such a, there's not a big impact on the local population. However, in the UK, we don't have those vast open spaces. And so therefore, in the UK, we have to be a lot more sensitive into how we actually do it. How do we balance out energy requirements versus food requirements versus recreational requirements? And that's going to be an interesting challenge as we go forward. The second one is how do we effectively move energy through space and time? And some of you have been to my talks in the past know this diagram. It's basically saying if you've got something like wind and solar, we know that the generation is variable. And therefore, we cannot rely on the generation to be there to exactly balance the load at the whole time. So we now need to be able to move say for instance, a kilowatt hour of solar generation at 1 o'clock in the afternoon using balance services to provide lighting at 7 o'clock in the evening. And so that the moving energy through time is a new aspect that we have to deal with and manage in this new system, as well as effectively using our network to move the energy through space. And if you saw those numbers, there's substantially higher powers that are going to be moving through the system, and how do we actually manage that within the network? The third really interesting question is, what are we going to be trading in the future? At the moment, we basically, our prices on the markets are largely dependent on the short-run marginal costs. In other words, what does the cost take to produce an extra kilowatt hour in that moment? And what it normally means is either shoveling in more coal or, thankfully, more gas into the system. And therefore, your costs associated with producing that extra kilowatt hour is largely dominated by that extra cost of fuel that you're using. However, you don't have an extra dollar per sunshine or wind that you can put into the system. So for a lot of the renewables, what's called the long run marginal cost dominates. And that means that it's the cost of putting an additional wind turbine in or an additional solar panel, which actually now starts to dominate. But the challenge that you have there is that you have to make that whole cost up front, and therefore it now means that, and there's no mitigation strategy to mitigate. If you have a low demand day, you can't reduce your fuel costs because your fuel costs are essentially free. So that means what we trade has to change, and the way we look at that is going to be really challenging. And here's an example of what happened on the 5th of April, where anybody who's on the Octopus Energy Agile tariff was actually paid to consume energy, and that was because of this disjuncture between short-run and long-run marginal costs. The fourth challenge is energy equity, and this is one to say, how do we ensure that everybody benefits from the energy transition, and not just a privileged few who have the ability to be able to have large amounts of capital investment. And this one's a really challenging one, and to say, how do we actually balance the needs of all the people with the needs of the energy system? And how do we rethink that through and provide a system that not only meets the national requirements required for instance, producing energy for the steel plants, but it also deals in an equitable way people who are vulnerable and need energy for heating. So this is going to be really interesting, challenging moving forward. The last one is about investment, and that is basically to ensure, how do we ensure that we get the most appropriate investment in the long term? And the word appropriate is in particular context. The picture that I have here, for those of you who have worked it out, is it's £1 million in 10 and 20 pound notes. And the reason why it's appropriate is that that was actually taken from a drug hall in South Wales. So that's probably not the type of investment that we want to go in the future. So the question is, how do we actually balance out investment so that local people can benefit as well as institutions? I think I might stop there for a moment, Saskia, and see if there are any questions that I can pick up.
Yes, so going back to your first challenge, Pip has asked, do you believe that agrophotovoltaic, I can't say it, agrophotovoltaic, no, I can't say it at all. You give it a go, you read it there. I'll summarise as agro PV projects could offer a solution to the land use issue in the UK. Tongue twister.
Yes. Okay, so I've never seen that word per se, but I presume by agrophotovoltaics, you mean can you combine both photovoltaics with agriculture?
You're and showing off there by being able to pronounce it.
Yeah. So the answer is, I think that is something that we are going to have to get a grips on. Interestingly, about 5-6 years ago, I ran a project with one of my final year students looking at how you can actually design a solar farm so that you can get, for instance, 80 or 90% of the light at any one point under the land. And it turns out that you can actually do it, and the cost is not that significant to be able to do that, but you do use a larger land area, because basically what you need to do is you raise the solar panels and you make them more sparse, and by looking at the shadows, you can actually do it. talking to some of my friends in botany, what it turns out, actually, you could actually create better land conditions for plants, especially under the summer conditions. And so that might actually be worthwhile to take that forward.
Thank you. And not relating to one of your challenges, but perhaps another challenge, Giles has asked, why is the rollout to electric vehicles estimated at 500 billion, I'm presuming pounds? So, you know, a huge cost there. Anything to say on that?
Yeah. So basically what I was looking at, I might have got my numbers wrong, but I just a quick number to say, you know, at the moment, assuming mobility doesn't change, and I'll deal with that in the last slide, we got about 30 million vehicles that we need to change over. If you look at the cost of a new car, you know, a new electric vehicle is going to be between 30 and 50,000 pounds per vehicle. Do the numbers. That's the calculation. If I got the numbers wrong, but that's what you should be getting out at. So that's basically the cost of changing the whole electrical fleet. But the interesting thing is that cost is not borne by the state, but by individuals and finance companies. Okay.
And going back to our agro PVs, just nice to see that Chris Jardine from Joju Solar is saying he'd be very interested in trialing one of those, and somebody else commenting that they can make nice sunshades for sheep. So there you go.
Yes.
Co-benefits and opportunities.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that sheep actually are better, and we've done a small project in Africa where we've put up sun shading in the solar panels that are sparsed out, and what we found is that the grass underneath is actually improved, and they have many goats there actually prefer it, and they're actually are getting they're doing much better under solar PV than they would under normal conditions.
In relation to one of your later challenges, Amanda has said, could it actually be easier to move demand in time rather than moving energy in time?
She's absolutely right. And so I think I should have used the phrase, and if I hadn't used it, it's possibly, that's my fault, apologies, is what you want to do is essentially decouple the time of generating energy to the time when you use the service. And there are multiple ways of, if you think of it, that longer train, then obviously there are ways of being able to store your service or change the time of your service, and that allows you to then play a lot more. There are a lot more levers, and you can get to a lower cost system. So one of the classic things is that a lot of islands, for instance, the Maldives, that they have water purifying plants where they basically desalinate the seawater, and what they do, instead of running batteries overnight, they store the water, and that's a much more useful way of doing it. So flexible demand is absolutely key and part of what we're looking to move forward. The question is, how do we make it as painless so that most people would not even would be able to make those changes in as little dramatic effect as possible, so that it's not just the early adopters who are doing it, but actually the late majority are also doing those changes. And how can we be smart about that? Yeah.
Perhaps one last question at this point. I am making note of a few we haven't yet managed to answer. We're not ignoring you, I promise. But just relating to that last point, perhaps Greg asks, given flexible demand, how viable is mass transfer to sustainable energy suppliers at the moment?
The key word is at the moment, and that's something that I think one of my slides picks up on is how do we actually reward flexible demand, and that's one of the interesting challenges that we've got to come through. This is around operations and trading. So I'll pick that up as we go through. So I've posed these challenges, and I'm now going to go on to saying how do we start to answer some of these challenges. Saskia, anything else?
Yeah, let's crack on.
Okay. I'm also conscious you told me that I had to talk until past, and it's now getting 1 minute to go. But no,
I said that didn't include questions. So keep going, Malcolm. Keep going.
Right. Okay. So basically, just to come back to say, how do we answer the questions? And one way that we're doing this is we created this Leo. As Saskia said, it's quite a large program. But the nice thing is that we've got multiple constituents and key stakeholders in the electrical system involved. So we got Scottish and Southern, which is our energy networks provider. We got Oxford City Council and the County Council, which helps with the planning and those things. We got the two universities providing some of the thinking power behind it. We got the Low Carbon Hub providing a lot of the community-based implementation. Nuve is one of the new energy providers specifically targeting mobility. Piccolo is providing a new platform for enabling us to do the new markets, and EDF Energy, so the research side of it, they're looking at to say, okay, what is the future of energy systems going to be and how does it affect the large energy companies? So that's the team, and the nice thing about that, it gives us a well-rounded view of what the challenges are. However, the challenge that we might have is that each one of us is basically looking at this elephant from different directions, and we're all kind of just seeing one part of the system, and therefore we get a skewed view of the system. And one of the nice things is that if you look at many of the projects that are going on at the moment, is you'll just have one of those people sitting there. I just, as a side comment, I noticed these were all male or largely male, and so therefore apologies for that. Men aren't always blind and stupid. What we want to, so rather than saying that we just look at one part of the elephant at the time, how do we look at the whole system? And so what we have done is we've developed a agile system development where basically all the partners can be working together on the same challenge in consort with each other, not going off in their own directions. And basically, just very quickly, we started by identifying the societal need, which is basically, and the two societal needs that Leo identified was basically providing an effective energy system towards it to meet the zero carbon needs. And the second one is to ensure energy equity for all. From that, we developed a theory of change to say what needs to change in the system. From that, we then identified what we called minimum viable systems. And each minimum viable system is basically a number of different actors and procedures that interact between them. And we have classes of MVSs, which might be looking at planning, operations, trading, and the like. For each one of those minimal viable systems, we can measure how well the processes are working and also what are the key measurement indicators that we need, the key performance indicators. We use that to learn how the system's actually working or not working, and we then understand, are we actually meeting the societal need? But what we all, more often than not, is actually going through this inner loop where we're actually saying, actually, we need to change our theory of change. We're not with minimum viable systems. Next time, Mel, I'm sure we'll be talking about some of the
we're going to have to get you to just repeat that last bit around the theory of change, as we lost you temporarily.
Sorry, Saskia. Apologies. So from the learning, we might need to change our theory of change. In other words, some of the assumptions we made might be proving wrong or have to be refined, and therefore we adapt our minimum viable systems, and we go through this reflexive iterative loop in terms of thinking of how we can adapt. The nice thing about this is that it allows us to actually play with the real world in a small way, but a meaningful way to start off with, so that we bump into the Rumsfeldian questions, the unknown unknowns. And we've been picking up a lot of those as we've been going through. So that's been our approach. So let's see how does that approach be used in tackling those 5 questions. So the first one is looking at land use. And so this has been mainly working with the City and County Council and Brooks University. And what we've been doing is identifying within the County Council both, where new housing developments coming in, which are new centres of load, also identifying where high potential value for solar and wind are within the County Council. And this is, for example, a system where we've identified where there are potential sites for ground source heat pumps in all the major towns within Oxfordshire. So by using this, it's starting to give us good information so that we can start to do long-term planning, and so that we can make sure that the system as we go forward is actually going to meet those long-term goals. Moving on. Operation. So one of the things that we've been looking at operation, and actually this is quite a large focus within within Leo is to create a local flexibility market. Remember I said we're going to get those quite large peaks and troughs in the power as we go forward. And so the question is, how do we incentivize that balancing mechanism? How do we smooth out the peaks of the generation to the smoothness of the load? And this is where we can either incentivize the use of storage or demand shifting or changing demand in some way so as to better align with that. And so what this has been doing is creating a market that people can participate within with various assets. And we're in the early stages of identifying what all the key requirements are to ensure that we provide a flexibility market that is appropriate. Alongside that, we're looking at trading. Remember, I said it's not necessarily kilowatt hours that we're trading. And so one of the things that comes out of that market is looking at value stacking. And this is our good friend Adriano. And this is one of the large batteries sitting in the Oxford bus company. And that was largely, was originally done to be able to bolster their supply for the use with the new electric buses that are coming in. But what's now been clear is that because of a large PV plant, actually they can smooth out the amount of generation we can, and we can also start to provide flexibility services. So here we can see a plot where basically we can reduce the energy within the, or the power that's coming into the site to almost zero for an hour's period just by using this battery. So that allows us to do a lot more flexibility in the system, and we're looking to say now how do we actually enable that to create more value in the overall system. One of the real challenges to say, there's lots of other incidental values that's created along the way, such as lower losses and other things in the system that other people gain the value from. And one of our big challenges is to say, how do we actually recognize that value and also then provide that value to the appropriate person who actually provided the value in the first place. And this is one of the really interesting challenges we have. The third area was looking at energy equity, and this is looking at smart and fair neighborhoods. And this is basically saying, how can we actually design a neighborhood from the community up? And so working with different communities to understand what are the different requirements and abilities and opportunities they have, and to be able to say, if you work as a community, you've got a much more powerful way because way of enabling the transition, because not only do you have more players to work with, but as a group, you can actually have more effect on the system. So this is an exciting work that Saskia is leading. And then the last one is about investment. And one of the really interesting ones that is developing and kind of on the side, but really important, is looking to see how do we actually couple various funding streams. So enabling both community developed funds, such as what's happening with the share offer document, but also to say, how do you then blend in and use large institutional investment alongside that? And how do you ensure that those two actually work well together? And so that the risk and the reward is shared appropriately. And this is to me, actually probably one of the most important aspects of LEO that's developing. So that's basically gives you a quick overview of how Leo is going to be addressing some of those challenges. I'm going to stop there, Saskia, for any questions.
We do have a few. We had one question here from David saying total system optimization is a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity for local community involvement as they're part of the solution. And I was just going to pick up an earlier point that was made by Eloise, who was asking if we'd heard of the local energy bill, which has been put forward by the organisation. Sorry, I've forgotten the organisation's name. Power for People. This is my understanding is that this is a bill which is about trying to change the way that the current system works, in that at the moment, if you're a local generator, and particularly a community generator, and you want to sell your electricity locally, you're facing huge complexities and costs as if you were one of the national power generators. And so it's trying to make those costs and complexities commensurate to the scale at which you're attempting to sell your output, your electricity. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to reflect on some of those challenges which go way beyond wires and switches.
Yeah, okay, so this basically comes back to let's just go back, is operation and and markets and the like. So if I go back to the challenge, it's the market is kind of largely be designed for what the world looked like in the 1950s and 60s, kind of post-war period. And it's been very slow to adapt and change. And although we've seen a number of reforms in the last 10 years and things like providing various national level flexibility services, what it hasn't dealt with is how do you deal with much smaller local distributed energy markets. And to me, this is one of the big challenges that we work that work needs doing on. What's interesting is I think it's going to get to the point where it's going to be almost unregulatable in the way that we're doing it at the moment. We're basically regulating every process in the system. It also provides certain barriers to enable vertical optimization. There's a lot of challenges around that. And so there's some interesting work that Laura Sandys is working on, and I've been talking to her about this as well, is to basically saying there's far too much regulation in the system. What we need to do is rather take the approach that the Food Standards Authority approached, which is basically to say you regulate what the perimeter is. Basically, what do the customers get is what you regulate, and you don't regulate how they actually get, how they get there. And that then will remove a whole lot of tape, a whole lot of red tape, which will, at the moment, is stifling a whole lot of really, really excellent innovation that's coming forward. So I completely support that. That what you need to, that removing the regulation in terms of local energy players, I think is really critical. But actually, to me is a small part of a much bigger puzzle that needs to be unlocked to really enable the whole one to go forward. So Saskia, I hope that one answers that one.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions relating back to transport. First of all, from Pamela, who was asking if, in your mind, the term electric vehicles means just cars, or is it also trams, trains, buses, and other heavy vehicles like lorries? Tell us more about your vision for the transport.
Okay, can I leave that to my last slide? I'll come back
absolutely.
to that is a question I addressed straight away in my last slide, because I think that.
And also Tim asking, can you envisage the smart meter network being able to undertake real-time energy trading? So are you switching off load during peak periods and perhaps charging car batteries, hot water, etc. during surplus periods? Is that part of our balance?
Yes. Yeah, so in fact, one of this interesting sub-projects we're working on at the moment is to say, what does a grid edge computing device actually look like? So at the moment, basically smart meters are there primarily just to measure. But I think in the future, that device has to do more than measure. It has to provide some information to the user. So I can see a huge
Malcolm, just
change in the way smart.
Apologies, Malcolm, we lost you again from, it has to do more than just measure.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Sorry, lousy internet connection. Just saying that the smart meter has to do a lot more than measure. It actually has to start to make some decisions which are under control of the user to be able to participate in these local markets. And as one of the projects we're looking at is to say, how do we actually create a smart meter that is properly smart and can allow you to participate in these markets in real time? My kind of starting point is to say that every person or consumer of electricity is both lazy in terms of they don't want to do a lot of work, but they want to be in control. So we have to evolve a system where it enables people to maintain control in a really easy and simplified way, but then goes ahead and does all the heavy lifting for you in the background. So I think to me, that's a really interesting space that we can move into.
Right, let's crack on. We've got a few more questions, but I think we need to move on, don't we now? So
yeah,
we'll come back to those if we have time at the end.
Yeah, I'm getting towards the end of my slides. So basically it's saying, what are some of the big societal challenges that are facing us, which kind of, will change the picture. And so I'm going to start with the one at the bottom left, which is coronavirus. That has really changed our society a lot more than people were expecting. I think it's I mean, we could just know now that, you know, what are the amount of miles that we all travel to come to this conference it was 0. So the way we do mobility, the way we do create value in the system is changed dramatically. So I think there are going to be some long-term societal changes from that. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out going forward. Is this just going to be a blip, or are there going to be significant changes going to be sticky and change forward? So that's one big societal challenge. The second one is, remember I mentioned earlier on, is that power is going to have to help with space heating, and space heating is the really big beast in the room. To give you an idea, is that we need about as much electricity again if we were to switch over straight to heat pumps. So basically double the amount of energy required that we need if we were going to use heat pumps. And that is a very expensive business going forward. And so one of the questions is, what's going to happen to building standards? And are we going to come to some really clever techniques like some of the Dutch are using an energy sprung to be able to do retrofits of housing in a much smarter way? And that will change the number. You know, what happens in the housing front will change things quite dramatically in terms of what actual renewable energies we require in the future. And the third one is around what's the future mobility going to look like? And this comes back to vehicles. My shorthand term earlier on was basically vehicles is mainly cars, because something like 80% of all the energy consumed for mobility in the UK is in personal vehicles. That dominates completely, but that doesn't mean that has to be the way of the future. And some of the interesting things that are coming through is, I'm sure a lot of you have been cycling a lot more than you have in the past and found how much more pleasant it is to cycle when there are not many cars around. There's an interesting change whether we can move towards more active transport. Are we going to have electric bicycles? Some of you might have tried those out, and they're coming forward. I know there's a real big push to actually, within government at the moment, to basically decriminalize electric scooters, because they might be a really good way forward. Shared mobility clubs, electric buses, electric trains, all of those may well be coming forward. We've already seen that there has been an ambition to electrify a lot of the train network. Unfortunately, that didn't quite make it to Oxford, but I think there's going to be renewed pushes to basically move that. I'm also hearing, for instance, that they're looking to, the government is looking to pull back the time and where the sale of diesel and petrol vehicles is banned from 2040 to sometime earlier in the 2030s. So there is some really interesting move on how that mobility shift is going to happen. My numbers were basically based on saying that the mobility patterns don't change, but there is a big caveat around that. We could have a substantial change in the energy required. I hope that answers the question.
So just picking up on...
Yeah, carry on.
I was going to say, just picking up on the transport theme, is now a good time. We've had a question about how you envisage vehicle batteries used for storage, and we did have a message emailed in earlier, which was, how practical is local vehicle to grid solutions as part of the energy storage and balancing solution?
Okay, so let me just go back. If you remember, one of the numbers I mentioned earlier on is that if we make the assumption that mobility doesn't change radically, and if we take that assumption, then there will be something like between 1 and 2 terawatt hours of energy storage on the system. And that, if you remember, I said that was about 2 whole days of energy storage, and that's massive, because that transforms what you can do in terms of the amount of renewables you can put on the system, especially solar, because solar's got that diurnal problem. It doesn't deal with interseasonal problems, but it does deal with the diurnal problem. And what's interesting, some of the work we've done is that if you go to the 25-75 mix of solar to wind, you'll need about a terawatt hour of energy storage to cover your diurnal requirements. Why am I particularly keen about electric vehicles is because it's kind of a second use of an asset. So if you remember I talked about the long run marginal cost. It's the cost of providing an extra widget. Now, because we buy vehicles primarily for mobility, the marginal cost to the electrical system is essentially close to 0. Yes, there may be some battery degradation, and that has to be factored in. But some of the interesting analysis that's coming out of the US, where people have been using Teslas for a really long time, is that the battery degradation can be a lot less than people are expecting. So to give you an example, is that there's been quite a few vehicles now, Teslas, that have done over 400,000 miles before a battery pack has had to change, which is about 4 orders of magnitude higher than people were expecting. Sorry, about 3 orders of magnitude larger than people were expecting. So electric vehicles can really provide a significant boost in that. Saskia, is that what was the other part of the question?
No, I think we're there.
Okay. Oh, is there a value proposition for vehicle to grid? Sorry, that was the other piece.
Sorry, yes.
So the challenge is what I came to earlier on, is that the market at the moment doesn't value that vehicle to grid proposition that much. And one of the things that a lot of people are exploring is, what does it need to take to create a market where vehicle to grid actually is useful? The challenge we have is in the environment that we are as of 2020, we don't need vehicle to grid. But by the time we get to kind of 2025, 2026, we absolutely will need vehicle to grid. And so the question is, how do we prepare for that transition?
And interestingly, on that point, David has asked about power walls in people's homes. Presumably they're one of those things that could help in the more immediate future in terms of local load and demand balancing. But your point about the marginal costs is the issue there. Yeah,
exactly. And also at the moment, I mean, if you're on one of the tariffs that tracks the daily usage, that could be a really powerful way to actually operate that battery. Any other questions, Saskia?
We've come to the end of the questions currently here. How are you on your slides? Are we there?
We're there.
We're there. So we do have one challenge from our colleague, or your colleague, Chris Jardine, who said this is all great talk, but what's happening? And Chris, what I'd say to you is, come and join us next week, because Melanie Bryce will be, who's from Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, who's the lead partner on Project Leo, will be telling you what we've achieved over the first year. I think, although Project Leo is currently billed as a 3-year project, we are all very mindful that this is a much longer term project. I don't know, Malcolm, if you want to say a little bit more in terms of actually how long we think some of this is going to put in place.
Okay, so if you look at Project Leo, what was interesting when we met in a room together, there was a general consensus that if we went for this funding, which is a 3-year funding package, we all agreed this is the first 3 years of at least a decade's journey. And so one of the things that we'll be looking at is to say, how do we actually pull together the financing together to make sure that this is actually a viable system that enables us to continue forward for the next 10 years. So there's been a lot of interesting thought about how does one provide a governance structure and a funding structure that plays well together to enable these local energy solutions to come on play a lot faster than would be under traditional methods. So I think it's really, really great. I just wanted to also pick up one other interesting, just from Nigel, to seeing that heating is of course subject to much wilder seasonal swings. He's absolutely right. What's starting to happen in the UK is, with my other hat on, I'm doing a lot of work now on the future of cooling, and we're starting to see cooling is actually becoming a rapidly growing requirement in the higher latitudes, and that there are a lot more air conditioners being sold than was expected. And so therefore that potential, that people are starting to talk about a summer peak as well as a winter peak. And so cooling may well become important in the future. And what's interesting is that if you go down a heat pump route, especially air source heat pump route, that effectively will provide you cooling in the summer. So we could actually see a biannual peak going forward.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our questions. Tabitha has popped in the chat the link for anyone who'd like to sign up to next week's webinar, and that's also available on our Facebook, the Low Carbon Hub Facebook page, and also from our news section on our website. So a huge thank you to you all for joining us, and especially to you, Malcolm, for a really interesting and informative talk. And I really look forward to working with you for the next 10 years at least on this topic. So thank you all very much for your time, and hopefully see you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everybody, and be safe.